Today I am interviewing about William Maxwell, who has passed away. Today I'm speaking to Patricia Maxwell Finland and William Ross Maxwell. William Maxwell was born August 1st, 1920. He served in the Royal Canadian Air Force and the United States Air Force. He eventually reached the rank of First Lieutenant. This interview is being filmed on May 30th, 2016 in Caledonia, Michigan. The interviewer is Hannah Jag, and I'm interviewing my grandma and great-uncle. This interview is being conducted for the Veterans History Project at the Library of Congress. Okay, so where was William born?
Our dad was born in Vineland, New Jersey in 1920, August 1st. And about 6 months later, he and his family moved back to Leamington, Ontario, which is where the family had a farm. And our dad was the youngest of 4 boys. Claude was 21, Clayton was 19, Robert was 6, and William was born in 1920, and he was the youngest.
Very nice. So what was William doing before entering the service?
Ross, you want to tell Aunt Hannah what Dad was doing before he went in the service?
He worked on the farm, and he was working in Detroit at Woolworth's, I believe.
Very nice. So, what war did he participate in?
And he joined the Royal Canadian Air Force, World War II.
Very nice. So how did he enter the service? Was he drafted or enlisted?
He enlisted.
And that was, I believe, in March of 1941. And he was trained for a year, Ross, I believe, to be a rear gunner, which we always heard was the tail gunner.
Did he have any more special training apart from others?
They trained all the time. They learned how to fly low, to drop mines, mine laying missions. And the way I understand, they were always training.
Impressive. So what was it like for him at first during training? How did he adapt to that very different lifestyle?
Honestly, Hannah, I can't speak to that because, maybe Ross can, but our dad really didn't talk much of anything about World War II and what went on unless we asked a question, and then we weren't always sure that we were going to get an answer to our questions. We were both pretty curious kids, but unbeknownst to us, he was involved in a lot of probably pretty scary things. And Ross happens to know a little bit more about it because he's investigated it over the last few years.
Okay, so where did he serve?
In Britain, England. He was based in England.
So did he talk a lot about how he felt when he was over there, or how he was away from his family and friends?
Actually, as I mentioned earlier, he didn't talk a lot about it. I do know, though, having been in Scotland, our mother was from Scotland, and she used to talk about, as did many of her relatives, would pass on to Ross and I, what a fun-loving individual he was. And again, once we knew more as adults as to what really went on with our dad during World War II, it's amazing that he had the personality that he did. Because he always came off, well, quite often came off as lighthearted and great storyteller, and hail fellow well met, as my mother used to say. Ross, you want to add anything to that?
No, that was good.
Okay, what branch of service did he enlist in?
The Canadian Air Force. Royal Canadian Air Force.
So, what was his position in the aircrew?
He was a tail gunner, and they called them pilot officers.
What kind of stuff did he do, like as a tail gunner?
They defended. He was on two different planes. The Wellingtons first, which was, I believe, a 5-man crew, smaller plane, twin engine, and then when the British built the Lancasters, they transferred to the Lancasters, which was a much bigger 4-engine plane, carried a way larger bomb load, and he flew 32 missions.
For the Royal Canadian.
For the Royal Canadian, right.
So, where did he fly during this time?
Over Europe, mainly.
Over here?
Mainly Germany.
Germany. So, like, how dangerous was his job?
Ross, do you want to speak to that?
Well, go ahead, Pat.
No, you go ahead. You know more of the specifics of it, but realizing that some of the statistics that we learned much later in life, that 25 out of 100 of the crew members that would fly 30 missions, only 25 out of 100 ever came back. So the percentages were certainly not in our father's favor, much less anyone else who was flying in some of those planes during World War II.
And so,
just from the Bomber Command Museum in Canada, in Alberta, the only odds of survival that were worse were the German submarine sailors.
Yeah.
So that sort of tells you something how dangerous these missions were.
so obviously he had to have a lot of bravery going into what he experienced.
Yes.
Very much so.
And, well, at war, you must make, like, a lot of friends and be able to connect with people over, what they experienced. Did he lose a lot of friends? Because it was such a dangerous job?
I'm sure he lost lots of friends, but then again, they probably didn't want to make all that many friends, because you go on a mission and they could be dead the next day.
I do know that. Oh, I'm sorry, Ross. Go ahead.
No, go ahead. When they all get back, their friends could all be gone.
Exactly. I do. We both know that there were some people that were very, very close to him, and unfortunately lost both of them. One of them was Nordy. He called him Nordy Nordstrom, and he was in the Royal Canadian Air Force with our dad. And the other was a fellow by the first name of Willie, which happened to be our mother's cousin, who was in the RAF, the Royal Air Force. And that's actually how our mother and dad met. Our dad was in the RCAF, they were flying with the RAF, and Willie and Bill, our dad, they were on the same planes at different times. And for some R&R, some rest and relaxation, they went up to Dundee, Scotland, which is where Willie was from and where our mother was from. And that's how our dad actually met. And it's got something really good out of the war, I think.
Yeah. So obviously, if they were close in missions with the RAF, did they, like, the things you hear about them during World War II, so they were connected in a lot of those missions?
Ross, you want to speak to that?
Yes, they would fly together. Yes.
Mm-hmm. They were on the same planes.
Lots of times,
yeah.
Yes. The Canadians were a Commonwealth in the
British Commonwealth.
The British had Commonwealth trained in with the other Commonwealths. Canada, New Zealand, Australia, Rhodesia, and South Africa were all sort of were Commonwealths. They all had training programs for Air Force.
Now, Ross, can you speak to when the U.S. went into World War II, and there was a time frame when any Americans that were in foreign services had to come back into the U.S. Military. how that happened with Dad?
I don't know. I always heard him say that, but I've never read anything.
No, I haven't either, and that's what we were always led to believe.
I
anyway.
never looked that up, but it probably could be looked up.
Because he did end up in the United States Air Force when he had completed his missions in the Royal Canadian. And when he did, he came back and became a tail gunner instructor. And Ross, that was where?
They let him, way I understand it, they let him finish his, he transferred to the Americans, but they let him finish his missions with the Canadians.
So you could say he was almost drafted back into the United States Air Force?
No,
I don't know.
Yeah, we're not sure exactly how that worked. We just know that he was he was taken back into the American Air Force at the end of his military.
He finished his missions and then went back
to the U.S.
To El Paso.
Yeah. El Paso, Texas is where he was when he was an instructor.
Did he have any specific missions that he would talk about with you guys?
Well, later in life we heard more about...
I know, but other than the sub-10s, there's a few things I remember him mentioning, but not really, not much.
One of them, Ross, I don't know if you know the detail, but when they were flying over Germany, and inadvertently, I think either the pilot or the co-pilot had flipped a switch, and the landing lights came on, and Dad had said, and this I heard this as an adult, but he had said that they were so lucky that the Germans thought maybe it was one of their own, because otherwise they would have been shot down immediately. Where a lot of us would be coming from as far as questions, that era of World War II, a lot of men and women came back to this country, changed dramatically. A lot of people grew up, and a lot of people didn't come back. And so what we found as kids, Ross and I'm speaking for both of us, I guess, right now, but our parents didn't talk about it. Our mother actually was involved in the war effort in Scotland, and involved with munitions and making sandbags and whatnot. So the war touched a lot of lives, whether they were in the military or out. And our dad chose to come back home, and when he got out of the service, really didn't talk about it a great deal with us. Now, we really don't know what he and our mother talked about specifically, but we didn't hear a great deal about it when we were growing up.
Right.
So while he was gone during this time, how did he stay connected to his family and friends back home?
How did he stay connected, Ross, when he was overseas with family?
Well, with letters.
Yeah, that was really the only communication that they had.
Lots of letters, right?
I believe there were a number of letters, yes. But I think that what little we can gather too is that most military people didn't talk a lot about what was going on. They were just, "Hi, it's good to send a letter to you or hear from you back." When they received letters back. But I don't think there was a lot put in the letters themselves.
And then you were speaking earlier about how while they were flying, they would fly at night while it was really dark. How many planes were typically out with them at a time?
There were up to 1,000. There were 1,000 bomber raids. And they would fly on the darkest nights. They wouldn't fly when there was a full moon or anything like that. The British flew at night and the Americans flew during the day.
So, would your dad say it was more dangerous to fly at night rather today, or vice versa?
It was probably more dangerous to fly during the day. That's why the British didn't do it.
Mm-hmm.
And then, so, like, what, were there a lot of times where your dad came close to being shot down?
Lots of times, yes. Their plane was on fire, was hit, and was on fire, and he helped put the fire out. I believe that's how he got the Distinguished Flying Cross.
So, to that, what kind of awards did he receive for his service?
The Distinguished Flying Cross.
He had a number of other medals as well, and but this was the major one, what they called the DFC, and he actually went to Buckingham Palace in March of 1944 and was decorated by King George VI. And as it turns out, his skipper, or the pilot that he flew most of his missions with, actually received the DFC that same day while they were both there.
So how many people typically in that era received the DFC?
Oh, it was a very small number, but I don't know that. Do you know that, Ross?
No, that's pretty easy to find out. You can Google it though.
Probably.
And if you Google like Canadian, google.ca is for Canada.
Right.
And what did that award signify?
Duty, it tells you in the, you can look that up. I mean, I don't know to describe it as for duty beyond.
I did have, there's just a small blurb here that said, this officer has an excellent operational record. He's participated in attacks on such heavily defended enemy targets as Kiel, Duisburg, Bochum, Wuppertal, and in several successful mine-laying sorties. The initiative and vigilance which he has always displayed have been assets of high value to his crew, and in no small measure contributed to the safe return of his aircraft on several occasions. His courage, skill, and devotion to duty have been most praiseworthy. And apparently that had some...
That's a good example. I mean, that's why he got the Distinguished Flying Cross.
Exactly.
So that kind of explains it right there. It's the safe return of his aircraft on several occasions.
And so how was he acknowledged back home? Like, what kind of things talked about him and his missions and his crews?
I suspect, Ross, I don't know that we really ever heard anything specific. He came from a small town in Ontario called Leamington. It was about 50 miles south of Windsor. Probably a community of about 3,000 people, maybe. He was a war hero. There's no doubt about that, and his family certainly were very proud of him. He had a brother that had also been in the war. He was in the Navy, and but they just, again, many of the returning military people just didn't talk about World War II, and so we're only going on some of the hindsight that we've gleaned, if you will, from articles and books that Ross especially has spent some time reading about our dad. We knew him as a wonderful individual with a great sense of humor and great storyteller. I might want to add too that he was a great dancer, as was our mother, and that's, I think, what drew them to one another when they met in Scotland, because they went to some dance halls. And each time he did go up, I know they did a lot of dancing. So they certainly did when she came to the States in 1946.
He would never say he was a hero. He would say he was just doing his job.
That's exactly right, Ross. Yep.
And so back to the dancing. When you were talking about R&R earlier, what would him and his colleagues do on their downtime while in the service?
What are you thinking, Ross?
Pat.
Well, we do know that that he spent.
They would go to dances and clubs and just.
Of course, there was alcohol typically involved, and probably smoking. A lot of people smoked at that in that era. If you've seen any of the old World War II movies, you saw a lot of that going on. But they also worked hard. I mean, our mother worked 12-hour days, and then they would go out at night and dance and whatnot. And he did ask our mother to marry him, and she did join him at Buckingham Palace to see him awarded the DFC, but it took her 2.5 years to get to the States. She was not a war bride, meaning she did not get married during the war, therefore the U.S. would allow her to come to the States. And there's actually some newspaper articles about our dad writing letters to King George after he'd been decorated to see if there was any way that the king could help him get Anne Bremner over to the United States so that he could marry her.
And do you know how that worked out for him? Did it help in any way?
Well, I don't know that the king was he did write back and was not able to actually, I think, get anything under rolling, but she did in fact get passage over on a Liberty ship, which a lot of people that would be involved with the World War II interest will have heard of. And she took the Winthrop L. Norman. We kind of laugh about that because that's something that she would always bring up when anybody would ask about it. She took that ship over, and I think it took about 13 days, and she arrived in Boston, and that's where our dad picked her up in June of 1946.
So when they came home, how did he do that, coming home from the war?
How did he get back, Ross?
Don't know.
We're assuming that they flew him back, especially when he came back to the States. Once he came back to the States and went in to be a gunnery instructor, he never went back across the ocean, did he, Ross? I believe that once he was in the States, he stayed here.
And when was that? When did he come back?
We're thinking
1944.
Yeah, later in 44.
And when he first arrived, how did his family and community react to it? His homecoming.
We really don't know. We never heard any of those kinds of things. But he didn't stay in Canada. He actually stayed in the States. Actually came to Michigan.
He was an American citizen.
Yes, he was born in the U.S., but the rest of his family, other than his mother, who was born in Mansalona, Michigan, the rest of them were born in Canada.
How was it difficult for him to readjust to civilian life? Did he have any problems with that?
We don't know that.
No, the only thing we can say is that, I'm speaking for you, Ross, I guess, but
Yeah.
he was successful in his life. He ended up getting involved in sales, became a professional salesman, and worked for General Motors in the Flint area in Michigan, and provided for a very nice life for our family. And he was always my hero, but that term was never used. Growing up, as Ross said earlier, you never heard of him being a hero, but in effect, he was for a lot of us.
And how do you think his experiences in the war and his life as a veteran affected him?
What do you want to say about that, Ross?
I'm sorry, it cut out.
Oh.
Go ahead. Go ahead, ask that again.
How do you think his experiences in the war affected him later in life and affected his personality?
I don't know, other than just the fact that he had to feel pretty lucky to get through the whole thing, and I think he enjoyed life.
Absolutely, I would agree with that. He was strong. He was a strong-willed individual. Knew how to make us laugh, and just an interesting fellow. I can only imagine how those years during World War II and being in those flights and losing people. It's amazing that he came back and he had a smile on his face a good bit of his life.
So you would say that because of it, he became very aware of what he had and how lucky he was to have it.
How precious life really
Yes.
is. You bet.
Well, that is great. Thank you so much for sitting down with me today and talking about your father. It's really nice.
It's my pleasure, Hannah.
Very welcome.
Thank you so much for putting this together.
He was your great-grandfather, right?
Yes.
That's right. Thank you.